Welcome back to Impact Day 2. I see many of you that went here all day yesterday. That's deep commitment to come 2 days in a row, especially when the basketball game is on. So on a Friday afternoon, so I deeply respect you showing up. We are excited at the energy that's gone into this 2-day summit, and we are thrilled to have our final keynote speaker. For that, I will turn it over to Allison. Thank you.
That was easy. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming on a little bit of a surprise rainy Friday afternoon, as Sarah mentioned, the basketball game. We have a really special guest today. So there's some of us in the room have been doing work since 2018 to work on inclusive teaching in STEM. We run a faculty development institute, and we have 2 programs that are through student success that promote the transfer of students from our community colleges. That work is primarily done by Elizabeth Heck, as well as support their learning through different activities in the Campus Learning Center. Through that program, it's sponsored by Howard Hughes Medical Institute, that is nationwide funding really excellent science as well as undergraduate education. And we got to be introduced to Dr. Brown's work through a seminar series that HHMI invited all of us to over the pandemic. It was anti-racist positioning in STEM and how to identify our biases and examine these things and our structures and our cultures. And Dr. Brown was one of the speakers. And I remember chatting with Elizabeth during that talk, and we were like, gotta bring him to VCU, and he is here. At the same time, we have some really wonderful colleagues in math that are doing excellent work in this area. And this was an on-purpose invitation to let them interact and explore this and talk about this and hear from Dr. Brown about his work. So this is co-hosted by the Department of Mathematics, and some of you have gotten to interact with him or will have dinner tonight. So I hope there's lots of math joy as well as interrogative inclusion and equity issues throughout the day today. So thank you all for coming. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brown. I have a little bit of a biography here. He has a Bachelor of Arts.
Maybe, I don't remember.
That's in mathematics from Lake Superior State University, and a PhD in mathematics from Purdue. He went through several postdoc initiatives. I saw a really cool sabbatical in Hawaii. If you can get that to work, that's a really nice route to take. So he spent 20 years as a theoretical mathematician in a highly focused research area, and is now converting over to doing STEM education research. So in this research, he's investigating the inequities in our STEM education system, perhaps especially in calculus, which is his focus area. We shared a link to a video that maybe you have watched, a commentary that he's written, as well as a PNAS Nexus article that was analysis of a nationwide data set looking at the impact of DFW rates on retention of students in STEM. So there's a variety of things that he can tell us about. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brown. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Really kind. I'm so pleased to be here. Pleased to be here to talk about inclusive teaching practices with y'all. Something I'm super passionate about, but I have to say it's also a little bit scary to be talking about it, because the truth is I'm still learning. I'm still learning every semester how to be a better teacher, more inclusive teacher, and that learning process is going to go on for the rest of my career. I don't ever feel, I mean, that's, you know, that old phrase is like, it's a journey, not a destination. That's what this is. So I'll do my best. Hopefully there will be something of value. But I do want to talk a little bit about my journey, because, you know, I am a theoretical mathematician by training. I spent 20 years proving theorems, publishing theorems about C-star algebras, von Neumann algebras, non-commutative probability spaces, and topology. And now I don't do that. Now I study equity in education, STEM education, or rather inequity. And I hope that by telling you a little bit about my journey, about that transition, that will help you understand and explain why I'm so passionate about this, why I feel such urgency about it, So if you'll humor me, I'd like to take you on a trip, if you will. Back to 2010, which is when the story begins. I was on sabbatical at what was going to remain an unnamed university, but now it's been named. I was on sabbatical and it was pretty awesome, I'm not gonna lie. But I'm there and they needed somebody to teach a course for their elementary ed majors. That is for, undergrads who want to become elementary school teachers, right? And I love teaching, I've always loved teaching. And this was going to be a new group of students. I'm used to teaching math majors and graduate students and, elementary ed majors. It's just a different group. And I thought, sure, that'd be cool. I'd love to try something new, right? Learn something new, teach a new group of students. But maybe even more importantly than the excitement and the novelty of it was the fact that at that time, my daughters were both in kindergarten. So it was very exciting to imagine that I was about to teach the future math teachers of my daughters. You know what I mean? So I'm like, yes, I'll take it. Gig sounds great. Can you connect me with a faculty member who's taught it before? Can you show me, right? And they do, they're like, yeah, go contact Professor X. And so I do. And it turns out Professor X is actually really invested in this course. It was kind of his baby. In fact, he literally wrote the book that was used at that institution for their elementary ed course, right? And he was a wonderfully kind man. He's a theoretical mathematician, just like me. So I instantly connect, right? He was deeply committed to education, to mathematics, to his students. As I say, he had written the book, this was his baby. But there's really no nice way to put this. It was the worst course I've ever seen. It was awful, right? It started with group theory. And in case you're wondering what group theory is, I can assure you, you're not alone. Because unless you have an undergrad degree in mathematics, it's very unlikely that you've ever heard of group theory, right? It's an undergrad topic, but it's like organic chemistry or quantum mechanics. But it's pretty advanced, right? People who don't have math majors very rarely take this. And this theoretical mathematician developed a curriculum from scratch, according to what he believed elementary school teachers should know. And it started with group theory. Right. So I get his book, start to flip through it. I'm like, oh my God, what is it? But I was on sabbatical. So what am I gonna do? Like reconstruct the curriculum? No. And plus, this was a theoretical mathematician. I had never taught this course. I had no idea what should be in it, what shouldn't be in it, right? Completely unfamiliar. He's a smart guy. I'm sure his experience it's fine. I'll just do my best and we'll see how it goes, right? Well, yeah, it was a disaster. It was really bad. I tried my best, don't get me wrong. I did. I really do love teaching. I've always given it my all. I care about my students and I tried to explain those concepts the best I could and they tried too. But they were no more prepared for group theory than they would have been for organic chemistry or quantum mechanics. Right? Talk about throwing somebody into the deep end and seeing if they can swim. That's what happened, right? And it was really hard. It was really hard on me because I would go in and I'd be teaching these kids and I kid you not, they wore their emotions on their sleeve. You could see the pain in their eyes. It was palpable in the room. And that's not an easy space to walk into every day when you're the one causing the pain, right? Okay, well, that sucked. And something else happened that year, 2010. A really stunning paper was published that had to do with teachers and student performance. The research question for this paper was, would a math teacher's math anxiety be reflected in the performance of their students? And this paper was done at the elementary level, if I remember right, it was first and second grade, but I could be wrong about that. Anyway, they took, elementary school teachers and they separated them according to who had high math anxiety, who had low math anxiety. And then they looked at the performance of the students in these classes, looked for differences. Well, not surprisingly, they found differences. right? But the differences weren't uniform. They weren't uniform across the student groups. Little boys in the classes whose teacher had low math anxiety or high math anxiety, there were no observed differences in their performance, which means, among other things, the teachers with high math anxiety were actually doing a fine job teaching the material, right? It was getting out there, the boys were picking it up, they were performing just fine. It wasn't the content that was the issue. It was only the girls that we were seeing differences. And this was not a causal paper, so they couldn't establish it, but the authors, they developed a theoretical sort of proposed explanation for what was happening. And I'll share it with you because it sounds very compelling to me. I don't know if this has been followed up, I haven't seen it. But anyway, the proposed explanation for this is the following. It's well known that children tend to emulate adults of the same gender. So little boys tend to emulate men, little girls tend to emulate girls. Emulate women. And when we're talking about elementary school teachers, almost all the teachers are women, right? So put another way, what this research really showed is that if you have an elementary school teacher and they have high math anxiety, it's more likely to be picked up on and internalized by students of the same gender. And it just so happens that all the teachers are women. And so this gets passed on to our daughters, not our sons. Right? So let me summarize. The year's 2010. I'm essentially torturing future elementary school teachers with group theory, and I learned that whatever trauma I can see in their faces, whatever trauma they carry out of my class is likely to be passed on to my daughters and not our sons. Yeah, that was pretty awful. Right? That was pretty awful. And I wish I could tell you that right then and there, I just completely changed. I wish I could say I committed to learning everything I could about equity and about inclusion in teaching. But that's not quite what happened. What happened is I took that incredibly uncomfortable thought and I tucked it deep into my brain, like the lizard brain, way back, right? And I went back to proving theorems about C-star algebras and von Neumann algebras because I belong to a research math department. And at a research math department, research is pretty much the only thing that matters. There's absolutely no incentive, no reward, no recognition for being a great teacher. You have to be not terrible, but being good doesn't matter. Excuse me, I need to blow my nose.
Like that, right?
That's a good trauma talk. Thanks.
Right, so, you know, I take this thing, I tuck it in the back of my brain, but you guys know how this works, right? Like if you take an uncomfortable thought and you tuck it in the back of your brain, it doesn't actually go away, it just festers, doesn't it? And it grows. And so, you know, over the years, this thought would come back and I did learn a little, you know, I tried to experiment a little bit with group work in class. I had just done exclusively monologue traditional lecture up until that point in my career. I started to be very intentional about sending encouraging messages. You know, this idea of math anxiety certainly stuck in my head, but I didn't really commit to learning about education and so on, not immediately. That actually didn't happen until about 2016. In 2016, another stunning paper was published. This one was about college calculus, not elementary school teachers, college calculus. Of course, I teach all the time, right? And what this paper found is that women leave STEM pathways, the undergraduate level, at 1.5 times the rate that men do after calculus. Biology, engineering, chemistry, all these majors are losing more women than men after the course I teach. That one I can't tuck into the back of my brain, right? And this is an illustration of a very uncomfortable fact of human nature, right? It's very easy for us to be apathetic when some injustice, when some inequity doesn't directly impact us. Yeah, that 2010 paper was about elementary ed majors. And 2010 was the first time I taught that course and the last time. Right? Not by design. I mean, it was a fine course I don't mean to poo-poo that course, but I just didn't teach it after that, right? So that 2010 paper, I could sort of tuck away because it didn't directly apply to me, but in 2016, that paper did directly apply to me, and I can't hide from it, right? So at that point, I really did decide that I need to learn about teaching, because I have a lot of training and research, like, all of us do with PhDs, yeah? We all have a ton of training and research. And I don't know about you, but I got essentially zero training in teaching when I was a graduate student. And that's not a comfortable thing, but it's an open secret. Like, does anybody in this room not know that? Right? Was that not your experience? Really? Yeah. So, right, 2000, I really had to face this fact. I had to face this super uncomfortable fact that I've got a ton of training and research, and I have a ton of experience teaching, both sitting in that chair and standing at the front, but I had no training. I had no education, right? I didn't know anything about pedagogy, about learning. And that ignorance on my part very well might be contributing to disparities in STEM education. And that's something I can't live with. I can't look myself in the mirror and just sort of rationalize it away, right? I can't just say, oh, but I love teaching. Oh, I love my students. Oh, I want them all to succeed. Because all those things are true. But the fact is, if my ignorance of teaching is leading to disparities to the students that are being harmed in my class, it doesn't matter if I have good intentions or if I'm malicious. The result's the same to the students that are being harmed, right? My intentions, my best efforts are irrelevant to students that are harmed in our classes. Oh, that was a bitter, bitter pill, right? A bitter, bitter pill. So I decided I need to learn something, and I've now, over many years, since 2016, made the transition, still working on a lot of things, but I made this transition to do education research and equity in education research. And a big part of that is inclusive teaching, because there's a lot of ways that inequity can creep into a big system like an undergraduate institution, but certainly inclusive teaching is one of our best tools for reducing equity gaps, for creating more equitable spaces. So I appreciate so much that you guys all are skipping a basketball game to be here to listen to me blather on about a topic that is so important and near and dear to my heart. I'd like to now talk about a study that my lab did that's basically an extension of a replication extension of that 2016 paper. And so let me do that. Maybe. Help.
Click on the screen.
Hey, there it is. So let me set up the study for you. Imagine you have two students. Fresh out of high school, they show up at VCU and they are ready to join your university. These two students have identical high school GPA, identical ACT scores. And in case you're wondering why we picked those particular GPA and ACT scores, it's because both of these students declare a STEM major on their way in. And those GPA and ACT in our data set, that was the average of incoming STEM students. So what you're looking at here are absolutely prototypical on paper, prototypical incoming STEM students. Okay? Moreover, in their first semester courses, the readout courses in particular, calculus, chemistry, right? In their intro first semester STEM courses, all of them, both of these students are successful, get C's or better in all of them. No D's, no F's, no W's, okay? So these two students have the same values in these three metrics. The question is, what's the chances that down the line, 4 years, 5 years later, that they end up getting a STEM degree? And the answer is, if you're a white man, you have a 48% chance. If you're a Black woman, you have a 28% chance. And I'm just going to sit and pause, in uncomfortable pause. because that one's hard to take, right? That one's really hard for me to take. And this work that we did, it was based on 110,000 students. Everybody in this data set came from a large public research institution. In other words, peer institutions of ECU, Penn State, and every other large research public institution, right? 110,000 students. That's what our data was based on. And this is an absolutely unacceptable disparity. It demands that we investigate it, that we figure out what are the reasons, what are the causes, how can we intervene, correct course, right? Demands that. But when we start to look for explanations and try to understand and try to fix, what we cannot do is we cannot blame K-12 because these students had the same high school GPA, same ACT scores. We cannot blame differences in interest because they both declared a STEM major coming in. And we cannot blame pass-fail rates in weed-out courses because both of them were successful in all of their intro STEM courses, first semester STEM courses. And I don't know about you, but I am absolutely of the opinion that if we were operating in an equitable education system, if higher STEM education was genuinely equitable, then when two students come to me with the same high school preparation, same interest in STEM, and same performance in their first semester STEM courses, those two students in an equitable system ought to have similar probabilities of graduating. And they do not. They're not even close. And the only thing I can conclude from that is that the clicker is still causing me problems. Hey, there it is. The ecosystem in which all of us are operating is contributing to structural sexism and racism. I see no other conclusion. Not everybody's going to agree with that, but that's mine. And I really don't see any other conclusion. I want to say, though, that this conclusion is not just based on this study or the 2016 study that we basically have replicated and extended, right? There's actually a whole body of literature out there, all pointing to the same conclusion. For example, there are studies out there that show that the beliefs of an instructor can be reflected in their students' grades, just as it did at the elementary ed level, at the elementary school level. That's true in higher STEM education as well. There was an amazing study done with 150 STEM instructors, 15,000 students. And they separated instructors according to a growth versus a fixed mindset, which is a statement about what you believe about intelligence. Is intelligence innate, or is it something that you can train and grow? And what an instructor believes about intelligence is reflected. If you have a STEM instructor in college who has a fixed mindset, believes that intelligence is innate, fixed, a typical minoritized student in their class is going to get a B. And if you have an instructor with a growth mindset who believes that intelligence is malleable and can be trained and grow, a typical minoritized student in their class is going to get a B+. The beliefs of an instructor are reflected in higher STEM education and the grades of the students in their classes in higher STEM education. Implicit bias, there's an overwhelming body of evidence about implicit bias. It is now an absolutely undeniable fact that if you are human, then you carry implicit biases. We all do. We all do. It's just part of human nature. It's part of our condition. Okay, so there's no question whether we have implicit bias. All we can do is try to manage it. We can try to minimize its impacts. But we have done now randomized control trials. This is the gold standard in science, right? Absolutely the gold standard. These two studies I'm referencing here are randomized control trials showing that STEM faculty tend to rate men higher. This study was done in two separate contexts. The first one in 2012, the second one was in 2019, if I remember, replicated the first, showing that STEM faculty will rate men higher than women on competence, on higher ability, on various attributes that are important to us in academia. We're also more likely to respond to email messages from white students than from non-white students, men over women. These are very complex studies. If you want to look them up, there's tons of very disturbing information in there. antiquated teaching methods. There's another component that point to structural inequities. There's a whole body of literature out there around active learning methods, and they now have enough to do meta-analyses. And the meta-analyses show two things. First of all, active learning methods do help all students, but they also shrink equity gaps between minoritized and non-minoritized students. So there is a whole body of literature out there all pointing to the same conclusion. We are operating in a system, an ecosystem that contributes to structural sexism and racism. Super, super uncomfortable conclusion, but we don't get to choose what's true, right? We have to trust the evidence, and the evidence to me is absolutely overwhelming and compelling. So what are we going to do about it? Well, I think what this calls for is a critical analysis of everything. Right? I don't mean to be too dramatic, but I really do mean that, right? I don't think there's anything that should be off the table at this point. When we talk about structural inequities, we don't actually know all of the components, all of the influences. We don't know quite which influences are greater than others. There's a lot to study. So I just want to run through a couple that we might want to put under the microscope and ask tough, critical questions. Like, is this contributing to structural inequities or is it not? Right? For instance, oops. Oh, I'm going to get into something. Curriculum. Is the curricula that we impose on our students, are those contributing to structural inequities? I don't know. If you introduce group theory to elementary ed majors, right? Is it? We have to ask these questions. How about our calculus curriculum? Nothing's off the table in my mind, right? We have to be able to ask tough, hard questions about curriculum. We have to be able to ask tough, hard questions about our teaching methods. That's what the rest of my talk is, so I won't spend much time here, right? How about policies? Do we have policies that might be contributing? For instance, at a major research math department, if you have a policy where really when you come up for annual reviews, annual raises, promotion, tenure, if teaching is explicitly devalued as it is at many major research institutions, if you tell your faculty, as it is said at many, that what matters for promotion is that your research is excellent and your teaching is acceptable, and by acceptable, we just mean not criminally bad, because that's what we mean, right? Not criminally bad. As long as your teaching isn't criminally bad, but your research is excellent, you'll still get tenure. That's a policy that might be contributing to structural inequities, right? Maybe, I don't know. How about assessment? It's the way we assess high quality teaching. I don't know how it works here, but I can tell you how it works at my university and many others that I'm aware of. When a junior faculty member gets hired and their teaching is assessed, who does the assessing? Some gray-haired old white dude who has no training in education and has only used traditional lecture their entire career. They take a notepad and a pencil and they go visit somebody's class and they're like, well, that was a brilliant lecture. I understood everything. Good job, kiddo. And that's the assessment. Is that a part that we might want to re-examine? Maybe, right? Right? Maybe. Anyway, there's a lot of things that could be here. So, could we all please take 1 minute and think to yourself quietly, what other structures, policies, what other cultural, departmental, disciplinary norms might be contributing to structural inequities? Please, 1 minute. Give it some thought. Okay, Please pair up or talk to two people nearby. This is a think, pair, share exercise. So please spend 1 minute talking to somebody nearby. What did you come up with? That was awesome. I love that. That was great. That suggests to me that y'all came up with some stuff. Is that right? Somebody want to share something?
I have a question.
Yes.
There was study done from, I think, American Physical Society, also by others. Why some countries have more female physicists than other countries. And they found that the presence of role models affected how the people were attracted to a particular answer. So in addition to these factors, could the role models, they have so many female role models or male role models, affect this how people succeed and so on?
To me, this is an example of something that belongs right here, right? Representation does matter. And that is a structural issue in higher education, isn't it? Universities with greater representation, with greater diversity amongst the faculty, those are going to be more welcoming and inclusive places. Excellent example. Anybody over here have one you want to share real quick? Yeah.
It's gonna do the attendance policies that say that if you get 6 classes, you fail the course.
Right. That doesn't impact and so for those who might not have heard, punitive attendance policies, right? Is that going to affect all your students equally? Not the ones that have part-time jobs, right? Not the ones whose lives aren't quite as simple and streamlined as others, those who have other things in their lives, right? Excellent, yeah.
I think socioeconomic status of students also plays. Compared to a student that comes to my calculus class, who is highly paid tutor, as opposed to the person that have to rush to work to make ends meet, and it's at the heart of it.
Agreed.
I'm going to worry for thousands of dollars to pay for my school fees,
Agreed.
while others so.
Agreed. Socioeconomics is a hugely important variable in all discussions around equity and inclusion, no doubt. Wonderful examples. Thank you all for sharing. So these are things, as I say, that I think we need to be putting under the microscope, asking hard questions, because we can't fix a structurally sexist and racist institutional structure if we don't know what all of the problems are and which ones are most impactful. And so we have to put it all under the microscope. Right, but once we identify those things, that's already a little hard, but it's not as hard as the next step, is it? Right? Because the next step, thank goodness, what's happening? What am I pointing at? Oh, there we go. The next step is to actually make that change, right? And here we run up against an immovable force, right? Institutions are so hard to change. But we are the institution, aren't we? We are it in some way or another. Like the institution is the union of us, right? So it's on us. And so I'd like to talk quickly about a few things that block change, that protect the status quo, that keep institutional inertia alive and well. One is a deficit model. Now, this means different things in different contexts, so let me explain what I mean by it. In the context of STEM education, what I mean by a deficit model is something like this. You identify some problem, maybe it's fail rates in calculus, or maybe it's low graduation rates, some issue, yeah? And you're like, okay, that's a problem. When I talk about a deficit model, what I mean is looking at that problem and then blaming students. You know why we have such high fail rates? Because the students aren't prepared, because the students don't study. You know why our attrition rates are so high in our majors and why nobody graduates? Because they don't have grit. We're saying, damn kids these days. Boomer, right? We all do it. I do it. We all do it. It's the most natural thing. Yeah, of course, we'd all love to have a classroom full of the most talented, brilliant students, the analogs of Serena Williams. I'd love to have a class full of them. I'd love to have the grittiest, most resilient, tenacious, John Lewis type characters in my class. I would love it if every student was like that, but come on. What's the issue with the deficit model? It's not that it's completely wrong. Of course, we wish that our students were better trained and all of that. But the problem with the deficit model, in my view, is that as soon as you take that view, as soon as you start to complain, as soon as you become a boomer and talk about all the problems that the new generation has, you take the spotlight off of yourself, you put it somewhere else, don't you? And now all of a sudden, it's not your problem to fix, it's somebody else's problem to fix. But we know, I think, the evidence is overwhelming that we have a contribution there that we have to address, right? So the deficit model to me is a very natural, it's a very common, and a very insidious protector of the status quo, of institutional sexism and racism that we can no longer pretend doesn't exist. Another, I'm sorry, where am I pointing?
She plays so she can see you and then she moves around. Switch for now.
I'm just gonna wink every time. The next one I want to talk about is a halo effect. So this is a cognitive bias, an implicit bias, one of the many implicit biases that we all have, right? And in its like an extreme form of the halo effect would be something like, hero worship. You have some human and you just think the world of them. They're an amazing human being. And you sort of put a little halo over their head, and then everything they do, you see through rose-colored glasses, even if what they do isn't so great. You dismiss it. You rationalize it. You find ways to protect that demigod status that you've anointed them with, even when the evidence suggests maybe they're just human like the rest of us, right? So that's like extreme, but the way I want to think about it, or the way I've seen it play out here in academia, right, is when we think about academics, I mean, again, I don't know about you, but I certainly think that like intelligence and brilliant research, like this is a virtue, right? This is something that really matters to us and we care about it. And so we really think super highly of Nobel laureates. In my field of mathematics, we don't have a Nobel Prize, but we have a Fields Medal, that's our highest honor. Right? And so Fields medalists are our demigods, and we think they're amazing. We love the work they do, and rightly so. Their research is incredible. That's why they get those prizes. And so it's not completely undeserved, but with the way the halo effect comes out, is you begin to think to yourself, oh my God, they're so smart. Oh my God, they're so smart at math or at physics or whatever the case may be. They're probably just really smart generally. They probably know how to construct a curriculum for elementary ed majors because they're a theoretical mathematician like me and I'm really smart. So they're really smart, so it's probably fine, right? And that's a halo effect, right? We are seeing what they do through some rose-colored glasses, or maybe it's not that example. Maybe it's you're at a conference with some high-profile person and you're at a dinner and they tell a sexist joke. I've been at quite a few dinners where that happened. And you know who called them out? Nobody. Absolutely nobody. So the halo effect, to me, that's a status quo protecting issue that we all have to think about. Another is fair weather friends. This one's very hard for me to talk about, but I will. A few years ago, I was having lunch with a colleague, and I had started, DEI work and this transition that I'm talking about. And it's hard, and you get a lot of pushback. You get a lot of pushback from the old guard, right? Who don't like changing the status quo. And I was complaining. And I'm like, this is so hard, and I'm sick of the pushback, and I'm sick of the distinguished professors coming down on me. And I'm just gonna go back to research and math where everybody left me alone. You can just do whatever you want, it was awesome. And I can't take it, I gotta go back to that. And my colleague looks at me and goes, well, that must be nice. That must be nice to just be able to walk away when things get hard. Because tomorrow when I go to work, I'm still a woman and I'm still Black. I hate that story, but that happened, right? And I was being a fair weather friend. Suddenly it started to rain and I was like, Homer Simpson, backing into the bushes, you know what I mean? Right, but we all have done this in some form or another, right? And this is particularly impactful if you're in a position of power, right? If you're a department head, if you're a dean, if you're a provost or president, when you suddenly prioritize things that exacerbate inequities over things that would reduce them, it's particularly impactful. It's not the only cases, but those are particularly impactful. And we all have to hold our administrators to the higher standards that we would like to see and hold ourselves to the same. Yeah, we cannot be fair weather friends and expect real change. Okay, wink, wink. The last one I want to talk about is privilege of patience. So what I mean by this, right, it goes back to that thing about sort of, it's easy to be apathetic when an inequity, when an injustice doesn't directly impact you, right? What I mean here is a lot of men might very well understand, the horrors of women losing their rights, but we don't feel the same urgency because it doesn't really impact us. We're a little more able to be patient with the legal system or whatever, right? A lot of white folks understand the Black Lives Matter and support it, but we don't feel the urgency, right? It doesn't land on us the same way. And when we're talking about higher STEM education, we all survived that. It's not our issue anymore, is it? Not directly. I mean, we're participating in it, but inequities in undergraduate education don't land with us the same way as they do our students who are being driven out at 1.5 times the rate of some other demographic. And so we have an abundance of patience, don't we? If it takes 20 years to solve this problem, fine, doesn't affect me, right? And I've been contributing to it the whole time, so I get to feel like I'm a good person. Yeah, and that privilege of patience is a very, very strong protector of the status quo, in my opinion, in my experience. So again, this is far from an exhaustive list. I've got 10 minutes. I really wanted to do another thing, pair share, but I will. But you're missing the basketball game? I feel like. It didn't. Okay. All right. Can we try to do a quick think, pair, share? How about if we just, you should never skip the think part. This is bad form. Oh my gosh, it's such bad form. But what if we skip over the think part and go to the share part? Can you imagine another protector of the status quo, something that inhibits change? Please discuss. I wonder, anyone back here have something that came up that isn't already?
Well, we were wondering if you covered just the way the system was built based on class and rank. Would turn back to the ball.
Sounds like a good one to me. Yeah, excellent. Yeah.
We talked about like fear and resistance to change, our innate resistance to change.
Yeah, so that's actually, there's another cognitive bias. It's literally called the status quo bias. And there's a lot of folks who have a very strong inclination to keep things the same. It's just a part of human nature, right? And we have to be able to talk about it, address it. We really want to make change. Excellent. So we've talked about what needs to be under the microscope, all of the different things that might prevent change or inhibit change. And I don't know about you, but at this point, I become very overwhelmed and cynical and dismayed. Right? This is hard, but I don't want to end like that. So what I want to do now is actually talk about inclusive teaching practice. Oh, that's right. That's what I'm here for. And I'd like to give you all a bite-sized thing that every single one of us who's teaching a class can do starting tomorrow. No joke. No exaggeration. Okay? And, oh, sorry, that was the think picture thing. So I'll call this like inclusive 1.0. It's like entry level. Absolutely, we can all do it. I don't want you to think for 1 second that this is the magic bullet that's going to change everything. It will not. But it can make a difference, and it can make a difference for a certain subset of your students that can be very powerful and impactful. And that is addressing the psychosocial variables, specifically. There we go. The first one I want to talk about is sense of belonging. So sense of belonging is this feeling of security and support when you have a sense of acceptance and inclusion in some community, context of STEM education in the STEM community, maybe the math community, chemistry, whatever. This is a basic human need. We are social animals, right? And it is a basic need of humans to feel that we belong to some community. The other one is self-efficacy. You can think of this as just confidence, right? It is the belief in one's capacity to be successful in STEM. So these are the two psychosocial variables that I'd like to talk a little bit about. And I will point out that I learned about these, or rather the importance of these things, from this report from the National Academy of Sciences, which I think was from 2017, if I remember right, 2018 maybe. Anyway, in this report by the National Academy, what they point out is that both of these variables are quite malleable. They can change. They're far from fixed. And I don't think I need any research to convince you of this, right? How easy is it to destroy a person's confidence in math? Okay, self-evident, I guess, right? Through our experience. I'm not suggesting that every person will have their confidence ruined by a single comment. We have different levels of malleability. Some people are not particularly malleable and some are very malleable, but certainly I don't think need a ton of evidence that malleability of confidence is a real thing. Same for belonging, yeah? Imagine you walk into a party, you don't know anybody there. Everybody looks at you when you walk in and then ignores you. You don't feel like you belong, but what if you go to that same party and the moment you walk in, somebody walks up to you and says, "Hi, I'm Joe, there's the snacks, can I take your coat?" Do you know somebody here, right? Welcomes you, greets you. Are you gonna feel you belong then? Of course, at least more. You might still be a little anxious, but it'll be better than the one where everybody ignores you, right? These are malleable variables. And the point from a teaching perspective is that as a teacher, you therefore have the ability to turn the dial in your students' belonging and confidence. These are malleable variables, so you can impact them. Moreover, these variables are associated with outcomes. If you believe you have the capacity to be successful, you are more likely to be successful. If you believe that you belong in a chemistry community, you are more likely to persist and get a chemistry degree. Okay? So again, as an instructor, you have the ability to turn the dial on your students' psychosocial variables, and turning of that dial can result in outcomes that we care about. Okay, so these to me are very important variables. Again, they're far from the whole story, They're not going to fix all of our ills, but they're something. So what is that something that we can all do? Well, you can walk into your class tomorrow and just start messaging positive messages about confidence and about belonging intentionally, right? This requires that you change nothing about your course. You don't have to change an exam. You don't have to change the way you teach. You don't have to change any of your policies. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't do those things, but I'm saying you don't have to, right? That's what makes this such an entry-level intervention. Yeah? Just simply be consistent and clear that you believe in your students. It's not bad to say it to your whole class. You won't hurt anybody by saying this to your whole class, but it is particularly impactful if you're doing it in a personal setting, in office hours, if you're writing notes on exams, right? If you have some indication that some student is really struggling with their confidence or belonging, to have a personal conversation with them and tell them you believe in them. You belong here because you belong here. You made it. You got through all the hoops. You did everything you're supposed to do in high school. You're here for a reason, right? It can be a very impactful and completely cost-free intervention on our part. I will say it's super important that you be authentic about it. Students have excellent BS detectors, yes, and they'll tell you this, or they'll tell me this, and in our focus groups, you know, inauthentic messages can actually harm the cause you're trying to help. So don't do it if you don't believe it. Don't say it if you don't mean it. But if you mean it, and if you're authentic, please, we can start sending these messages and we can be repetitive about it. It actually is important to be repetitive because in many ways, these psychosocial variables are like trust. It's very hard to build trust and it's very easy to destroy it. Yeah? And one message, one action is not going to build a lot of trust. One message is not going to build a lot of confidence or a lot of belonging. Consistent, repetitive, authentic messaging will. Right? All right, so what is this going to impact? Well, I'm not going to pretend that this is going to impact all your students because a lot of them won't be impacted by it all. Nobody will be harmed by it, but it won't necessarily impact all, but it can be super impactful. So let me share this anecdote with you. Last month, I received this email message from a former student. Just found this, the original note faded, but I rewrote it. Just thought you'd appreciate knowing I've held on to this for encouragement for 10 years. That's exactly how I felt. I was like, oh my God. Right? And I don't know what she's talking about. And so, but luckily there was an attachment. So I click on the attachment. And what was in the attachment was a pic of an exam that I had given 10 years prior. And I had written a note at the bottom of her exam. And I wrote it in red ink and it had faded. And that's what she's referring to here. And so in, you know, dark black pen, she rewrote the note. And so I'm looking at this and this is what I wrote. There's a reason you're here. You're smart. When doubt fills your head, remember how far you've come and remember that I believe in. And after a decade, she still remembered that. It was that impactful. Now she did struggle a lot with confidence, a lot. It was hard to see. She was very talented, and she struggled a lot, but I was very consistent in my messaging, and this was just incredibly moving. And in 2022, from Ann Arbor in chemistry, and I'm sure great things await. She was very, very talented. Okay. So I've been talking about psychosocial variables. This is not the whole story. I'm actually one of the research projects I'm working on right now is to develop a measure of inclusive instructor behaviors that measure how students are perceiving your class with respect to belonging with confidence. So there's much more that could be said here, but I've just introduced, you know, a bite-sized little piece that, as I say, we could all go to our classes tomorrow and try to be intentional about promoting. But there's much, much more to inclusive teaching. And I don't have time to go through it all. I will say that it's hard to say which of these is most important, and I hesitate to do this, but if I had to pick one, if I had to pick just one of those, I would probably pick the student-centered thing, right? To decenter, to get us out of the middle of our thinking and decenter ourselves and center the needs of our students. That manifests itself in so many ways. So many ways. And those other things are also super important. So again, I hesitate to pick one, but if I had to, that's probably the one I would pick, right? So let me give you an example of what I mean by student-centered. Every time you think about how you organize your class, a policy you're going to do, an assignment you're going to give, every single aspect of your class, you might want to ask a question like, who is going to be excluded by this decision I make about my class? And at first, this is not my idea, by the way. I'll show you who I learned this from in a minute. But the first time I thought it, I was like, what a silly question. I don't exclude anybody. I mean, nothing I do is intentional. Oh, wait, intentionally excluded. Oh, yeah, I don't do that, but I might be excluding people unintentionally. And again, my intentions don't matter. Yes, my intentions don't matter to students that are excluded. So here's a very simple example. Imagine you have office hours every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 1 o'clock, like some of us might have done, I don't know. Right? Who does that exclude? Every student that has a class. Right? And I'm not suggesting that you can ever find office hours that will accommodate all your students. If you have big, that's not going to be possible, but there are certainly better and worse choices. Yes, you can try to minimize the exclusion of your decisions. Student-centeredness is just that. You simply, for every aspect of your course, everything you do, you ask yourself, how is this going to impact my students? Is this going to help them learn? Is this going to help facilitate their progress to their degree, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, a lot to be said there, as I said. We can forward. Hey, this first thing on the left is a resource I just want to advertise. I have nothing to do with either of these, so I don't need to declare a conflict of interest because I don't have one. But the first is an online teaching program. It's basically a professional development program. It's all online. It's absolutely wonderful. Highly recommend it, the Inclusive STEM Teaching Project. I have learned this idea of asking who is excluded by your decisions from Drs. Hogan and Sathi, who have written the book on inclusive teaching. It just came out last year, if I remember correctly. Anyway, those are two wonderful resources, but absolutely the best thing you can do if you're ready to dive in head first and learn all you can is to get together with some of your colleagues and take advantage of the resources right here at VCU, but do it with your colleagues. This is called a faculty learning community. And research very clearly shows that when you get together with colleagues who have shared interests, shared motivation, all towards a common goal to become better, more inclusive teachers, and you go through some sort of training. I mean, it doesn't have to be this. I'm promoting this, but it doesn't. Maybe it's a journal club. Maybe you read the book of Hogan and Sathi together. Whatever. Do it as a community. Yes, do it together. You will help each other solve the problems about implementation. It's not always clear how you're going to implement inclusive teaching practices in your class. Having a community help you sort that out can be very helpful. It will help you with accountability, motivation, all kinds of things. Yes. So with that, I guess I will stop.
Anybody have a question? We're looking at Zoom as well.
You said in your study that you assumed that students that had a 3.27 GPA had equivalent backgrounds. There's a book by the current president of UVA, 5 miles away, worlds apart, two local high schools, TJ and Freeman. And I can imagine that students with 3.27 GPAs from TJ and Freeman have vastly different.
With the same ACT score?
I don't know about that.
But see, that's the deal, right? We controlled for GPA and ACT. And I hate to use that as the explanation to your answer because I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but there's actually a tremendous amount of research that shows that when you talk about predictors of success in undergraduate education, the high school GPA is a far better predictor than ACT. What? Despite the fact that there's great variation, it's still a better predictor than ACT, which seems weird, but that's what the data shows. And that came out in our study as well, by the way. In fact, when we did our regression model, the ACT, and I'm not exaggerating here, it was non-significant. It was non-significant for 110,000 students, right? It predicted nothing above and beyond high school GPA in our model. Wow.
It probably has to do with economics, because I mean, a lot of wealthy students get trained.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make them more successful, does it?
Doesn't make them believe in themselves anymore.
Yeah.
Feel like you've been to church? Go ahead.
Oh, I got one from Zoom.
Oh.
How did you control for variation in course sequencing differences for the first year curriculum across universities? I know I should repeat.
Say it again.
How did you control for variation in course sequencing differences for first year, curriculum across universities?
We did not control for course variation in first year studies. We only looked at first semester courses, and yes, different universities have different courses in their first semester, but that is what we controlled for in our study. So we did not control that. Yeah.
The online course, how would we access that? Is that something that I can?
That's Sarah.
Yeah. Yes.
What's the one thing you changed in calculus that you wish you did earlier?
Everything. But let me be more specific. Sure, let me be more specific. So now the way I teach calculus is completely unrecognizable to the way I did it even 10 years ago. I spent the first half of my career doing traditional sage on the stage, 50-minute monologues, preaching at people. I had a banking model view of education. I viewed students as a bank into which I was going to deposit information. And I hope they picked it up. And if they didn't, whatever, right? I really didn't see education from a more sophisticated view. And the banking model actually is still super prevalent, as is traditional lecture. So now what I do is I teach calculus. It's maybe I spend 50% of the time talking, probably less. And most of the work, most of the learning is actually done in small groups where I am very careful to curate problems that scaffold ideas. So I can put kids in groups, and I'm very intentional about organizing those groups to make sure that dynamics aren't getting in the way of learning. But in my class, every week, I will assign students into groups of 3 or 4, and they spend at least 50% of the time in class working through carefully curated examples which scaffold the ideas up to where I would have done it if I was just lecturing.
And you get a chance to finish the curriculum, the material that samples.
I do. And I kid you not, I will put my students against anybody.
Have you organized those groups? So you were intentional about it.
Yeah.
I was wondering how many groups we're talking.
Well, okay, so this is an excellent point. So the calculus class that I teach every year now is a very special example. It's a very small class. It tends to be around 25 students. So it would not be possible to do this if you had several hundred. But in a small class like I teach, I am able to do it. And when I organize them, the first week, it's a bit random because I don't know my students yet. But the first week, you do have to go around and pay attention to how the groups are interacting with each other. Are there some people who are super aggressive, talk over others? Are there some who are shy and withdraw? If so, use that information when you construct your groups the next week and make sure that you're not putting 2 loud talkers or 3 with somebody who's just going to disappear into the woodwork. Right? So the intentional construction of the groups is an iterative process, and certainly in the first few weeks, I'm sure the dynamics in the groups aren't great. But hopefully after 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, I've sort of figured out which groups are going to work better together than others. But I don't just do this blindly either. I also get feedback from my students. I ask them straight up. Is there anybody in this room? I mean, you can't do this in class, but I do this in my office hours. I do that after class, before class. Anybody got beef in this room? Anybody I shouldn't be putting together? How's it going for you? Are there some people that you prefer to work with other than others? Getting feedback is very important to helping you construct groups where the dynamics facilitate learning instead of inhibit it.
Can I ask a potentially inflammatory question?
Please, I love inflammatory.
As we were talking about before, we are facing 15 years of disrupted math education from COVID. We know that math was deeply impacted, especially for those the elementary kids, right? You know that. Have you or your collaborators had any conversations about quite how many math classes we require for non-math majors? Like, do we need calculus or biology?
Ooh,
Or should it?
Let me just say
I
very clearly.
agree with that. I'm saying if we don't ask that question, how do we know?
Look, I'm a mathematician, and I am absolutely here for that question. I am here for it, right? Because the status quo is harming our students. And at the end of the day, I don't care what my predecessors did or what history or the norms, none of that matters to me. What matters to me is that we create an equitable education system. And if that means I have to put my own subject on the potential chopping block, so be it. That's a great question. I don't have an answer.
Don't know. We'd have to pull data, I think.
Yeah. No,
And then it would start a national conversation potentially with the professional schools of, do you really need calc to be a doctor?
And these are critical questions that are going to cause a lot of trouble, but look, this is going to be disruptive work. If you're going to change the status quo, you are going to have to be disruptive. You're going to have to pick fights and get in trouble, ask hard questions. It's the nice way to do that. But that's what's going to happen. I love this question. Don't have an answer, but I do love the question.
And I love all you and I love calc.
One in the back.
Sorry.
I had a question about you.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had encountered cases where you find yourself having to balance trade-offs as you make changes to your curriculum. Can you talk about that? So trade-offs in, say, the amount of time you're spending with students in groups versus some other activity.
Yeah. So the trade-off thing is absolutely real. And going back, sorry, I forgot who asked me. Somebody asked just a second ago if I got through the whole curriculum. The answer is yes. That is not an untrue statement. But in full disclosure, there were some trade-offs that had to be made there, right? And so the trade-offs didn't come in topics. The trade-off came in the reduction of particular kinds of tricky examples that all occur in a single topic. So for instance, those of you who have taught things like the chain rule, right? The chain rule is a very difficult thing for students to wrap their heads around, and it becomes exponentially worse when the algebra is horrible, right? If you have to take a second derivative using the chain rule and the algebra is horrible, like forget it, you're gonna lose 90% of your students. And so the trade-off I have had to make in the scaffolding is to be very careful about the algebra difficulty that I put into my problems, because that's not the point of calculus, not to me at least, right? And so I have to be careful and make sure that my algebra isn't the reason students are stumbling with difficulty. And that is not the case in a traditional calculus class. In a traditional calculus class, difficult algebra is relished. We do it on purpose. That is a open secret. Right? We do that on purpose to separate the good from the bad. And so the trade-off I've had to make is not to reduce the curriculum, but rather to be very intentional and very careful in the curation of the problems that I give to my students, if that makes sense. Yes.
What's your opinion incorporating technology? When I say technology, I'm looking not for calculators, but even the maples, the mathematicas, into your calculus classroom, so that the students coming from the other STEM classes use the subject as a language, as a mediator of knowledge transfer in their areas, rather than the algebra, the trig, the inverse trig that some of us read.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, here's where I'm the boomer. Because I don't use any technology in my classes and I don't let my students. So yeah, I guess I'm the boomer. Right?
Averse, sense.
Well, the honest answer is I just don't know how to use a calculator. And so, yeah, that's a bad answer, isn't it? But that's, yeah, I really am not a huge fan of technology, and that's a poor reason not to do it. So maybe that's something I really need to add to my own education. Maybe I need to learn how to use technology to facilitate deeper learning, because I'm sure that's possible. There's probably even research that shows that. I don't know. But yeah, I don't personally participate or encourage use of technology in my classes. And half of you are like, God, this guy was great, and then he sucked. What a stupid thing to say. Shattered on the ground.
Can I encourage reception now? Are you ready?
Hang on.
It's 30, BCU is 30.
Uh-oh, down by
That's
3.
fine. That's fine. It's plenty of time.
I have 2 things to share. There are some flyers out with the food that will invite you if you would like to join for a STEM faculty networking event that Elizabeth has set up for faculty from VCU, Brightpoint, and Reynolds. We have interacted as much as we can through our HHMI grant to do this work together. We're all teaching the same students and we benefit by interacting and sharing. So there's a QR code that you can scan to register, and it's in 2 weeks. March 31st is in 2 weeks, right?
Sure.
Yeah. Over in the Shift Retail Lab, which is on Broad Street. And we are providing parking for our community college colleagues, which we will take care of today for those who are here today. And there's some question prompts if you want to continue this discussion about who's responsible for inequities in STEM. These papers are around also if you want some questions to share with people that you're snacking with. Okay. Thank you so much.